Thank you, Madam President, and my apologies to Senator Champagne if he thought he was next. I've kind of decided I'm going to restrict my comments on the bill before us to Section 4, which is kind of the part that I drilled down on immediately before coming out here to discuss the legislation before us. But I do want to make a couple of comments about the bill in its entirety beforehand. One thing is I certainly will align myself with the comments made by my Republican colleagues, Senators Kissel, Berthel, Ciccarella, and Minor, who spoke on this bill already, and I think they did an amazing job of pointing out some of the concerns. Obviously, all of us are concerned about a clean environment, eliminating pollution, and leaving a better world for future generations than we found it. I guess what I would say about that, though, is that I don't believe the people in this chamber or the people in this building are qualified to make those kind of determinations. I think that is far beyond the knowledge or ability of the people in this chamber. And I'm concerned that legislation like this is rushing us into something that requires a lot more thought. I think it's reckless, in fact, because I believe that there are things that will result as because of the legislation that is before us. In effect, Madam President, we are interfering with commerce, with property rights, and our overall economy and the world we live in this bill in ways that are going to have ramifications that we cannot even measure here today. And it's all based on a childlike understanding of the climate in this world over time. It's frustrating to me because the debate is not settled on the subject of climate change, and the nature of what we do next as far as energy and how we heat our homes, how we use transportation, all does need to be discussed. But it does not need to be decided today in this chamber for the state of Connecticut based on a tremendously infantile understanding of the problems and the ramifications of the legislation we're about to pass. You know, the founding fathers of this great country were super smart guys. And the one thing that they focused on more than anything else was limiting government. Limiting the scope of government and the ability of that government to interfere with the lives of the citizens. Our system requires us to respond to their needs, their wishes, and their wants. And I'm afraid that this bill doesn't reflect that at all. I think this is the will of a few people who have an agenda that they're going to push whether the people want it or not. And it's irresponsible, Madam President. As I said, I'm going to focus just on a small section of this bill. But this climate debate, this electric vehicle debate, the notion of batteries, all of that needs to be discussed. And it needs to be discussed by people smarter than us to give us real guidance what to do. I would encourage folks listening to read an article that was in the Wall Street Journal back in December 23rd, 21. The electric vehicle push empowers China. It's just a brief synopsis of how this major push to switch us from fossil fuel-powered vehicles to electric vehicles is going to affect our economic situation in a huge way. It goes on to say that China has a near monopoly on rare earth elements like neodymium and dysprosium, which are the things that they use in the batteries for electric cars. There is news from China that they know full well that they're going to control the supply chain for these items. And they've said, well, you never know, the prices might rise. I encourage anyone in this chamber to compare the cost per mile for an electric vehicle versus a gasoline-powered vehicle and tell me how consumers are going to make up that difference. And that's today, before China realizes that they have a firm grasp on our energy supply and our ability to have transportation in our own country. An electric vehicle motor requires around 2 pounds of rare earth elements. And there's a report that says that China controls about 85% of the global supply of those elements. It's just something to think about. I don't know if anyone in this room has considered where those rare earth elements come from or has investigated the mines where they dig these things up. Google it. I think you'll find no shortage of dangerous and deadly environmental impact to the negative, not to mention human rights abuses that would shock any of us. Those things are not considered in this legislation. It's just a childlike, oh, well, we have to do this. Electrical vehicles, it's the future. I am all for us figuring out the best way to preserve our world and to come out on the other side in a better way. But I will admit that I don't have the answers. And the people in this room ought to admit it too. We need to study these things and we need to learn before we jump in with both feet and we commit our constituents to things that we don't have the ability to change afterwards. Forgive my rant, Madam President. Back to Section 4. Section 4 is focused on requiring the owners of residential property that they rent to others to allow the creation of electrical vehicle charging stations. And I just want to get a few things on the record to start with. So through you, Madam President, a couple of questions for the proponent of the bill.
Please proceed. Senator Haskell, prepare yourself.
Thank you, Madam President. I just want to confirm that this legislation before us is indeed a mandate on the owners of certain types of property. And I'm reading lines 318 through 336. And it looks like it's broken down into three sections. Properties that are 50 dwelling units or less, property units that are 50 to 250 units, and then properties that have over 250 dwelling units. And each one of them is, under this legislation, going to be required, as in shall approve, which appears in each section, written request by a tenant to install an electrical vehicle charging system. Is that correct through you, Madam President?
Senator Haskell.
Be glad to respond to the good senator's question, but I first have to address his comments. What would be reckless, Madam President, is to do nothing in the face of the climate crisis. And I understand that the good senator might not agree with certain provisions of this bill, and to that I remain open to suggestions, but to suggest that anyone in this chamber supposes that they know all the answers. Of course we don't. Nobody knows all the answers to these complicated questions. That's why we have a public hearing process. It's why the Transportation Committee and the Environment Committee has consulted so many experts over the last few months. And I'm not just talking about the experts who agree with us. I'm talking about sitting down with the very people who testified against this bill to figure out, hey, how can we work together? How can we solve this problem? How can we leave the planet a little bit better for the next generation? What's reckless would be to do nothing and continue with the status quo. And with regard to the section that we're talking about now, that's exactly the process that we had. We sat down with the experts from the Landlord Association, from the realtors, and we found language that might work. The language that we came up with to the good senator's question does, in fact, require that in the event a tenant requests to install a charging station at a parking spot that is theirs, that they pay for as a part of their rental agreement, well, then the landlord has to enter into an approval process, and the tenant has to provide a written approval that they will pay for the installation, pay for the necessary infrastructure upgrades, pay for the ongoing electrical costs, and pay for the removal, if applicable, of that charging station. In that sense, I suppose it is a mandate. But let's imagine, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle sometimes say, let the free market decide. Let's say that the free market decides that tenants don't want charging stations installed where they live. Well, then nothing would change under this bill, because it doesn't require that overnight landlords install charging infrastructure. It only requires that they don't impose restrictions which unreasonably restrict a tenant's ability to install this charging infrastructure at their own cost. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I just want to confirm that the answer was yes. This is a mandate on those three types of property owners. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Haskell.
No, with all due respect, Madam President, it is not a mandate that the landlord install charge and infrastructure. It is a perhaps mandate that they enter into a written agreement that does not unreasonably restrict a tenant's request to install charge and infrastructure at their own cost. So it does not mandate the installation of charge and infrastructure. It merely creates a relationship whereby a landlord and tenant can mutually agree to see this infrastructure installed through you.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. So I heard that no, it's not a mandate. It is perhaps a mandate. But I think it's quite clear from reading the language before us, when it says shall approve, that is different, and everyone in this building knows very well the difference between shall approve and may approve. May approve means it's up to that person to decide for themselves. Freedom, in other words. Shall approve means you must do what the law says. And this bill is a shall approve. This is a case, Madam President, of the people in this body believing that they have the right to dictate to property owners what they should do with their own property. I just want to, I was hoping that Q&A would be a little smoother so we could just get through the details of the bill, because my purpose is not so much to debate it at this point, was simply to lay out what the bill says. But I think I'll just do that myself, since it seems a little simpler to do that. The three sections require that landlords that own 50 dwelling units or less will have all the way until 2024 October to accommodate this request by their tenants. Landlords that own between 50 and 250 dwelling units will have till 2023. But if you are a landlord that owns over 250 dwelling units, that means that you have only until October of this year to comply. I'm curious, through you, Madam President, when these number of dwelling units is referred to, does that mean that they all have to be at the same location? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Haskell.
Thank you, Madam President. The legislation does not specify that all of those units have to be at the same location.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. So that means that if I am a landlord that owns 250 individual single-family unit properties, I would only have until October 1 of 2022 to accommodate each of those 250 tenants. Is that correct, through you, Madam President?
Senator Haskell.
Madam President, I suppose it would depend. It sounds as though in this scenario, there's 250 different single-unit properties. In that case, I can't imagine that each one of those single-unit properties offers more than 5 parking spaces. The legislation does not impact any property with fewer than 5 parking spaces.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. Whether we can imagine it or not is not important. It's what the bill says and what could happen to a constituent of one of ours who is simply trying to use their property to benefit themselves and further their station in life and grow our economy. The idea that it might not happen, or it's not likely to happen, is certainly relevant. But what I'm trying to get at is just how overreaching the legislation before us is. Speaking of the 5 parking spaces, who determines whether or not there are 5 parking spaces at any individual property? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Haskell.
Thank you, Madam President. I believe that would be determined by the landlord through their lease. This legislation pertains only to landlords which provide parking as an extension or as a condition of rent. So if the landlord decides to include parking, and if that property includes more than 5 parking spaces, then the legislation would apply.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm reading line 395, which is in subsection F. And that says this section shall not apply to residential rental property where, and it says there are fewer than 5 parking spaces. Can the gentleman point me to where that's up to the landlord to determine? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Haskell.
Madam President, if I understand the question, the good senator is looking for the portion that says that the legislation does not pertain to a rental agreement unless such rental agreement stipulates parking.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I believe that's a separate section. I'm referring only to the caveat that exists in lines 391 through 390 or 401. subsection F, where it says it does not apply to residential rental property where there are fewer than 5 parking spaces. And I'm just curious whether if I'm a landlord, I can determine how many parking spaces there are, or some other body is going to tell me whether or not I have 5 parking spaces. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Haskell.
Thank you, Madam President. Through you, I guess I don't understand the question. There either are or there aren't 5 parking spaces. And if you as the landlord decide that you're going to provide those more than 5 or more parking spaces as a condition of the rental agreement that you enter into with the tenant, then there are more than 5 parking spaces. If you as the landlord decide that you're going to use all 5 parking spaces for yourself and instead provide no parking as a part of that rental agreement, then the legislation would not be relevant.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate the gentleman's remarks, and I am very familiar with Section 4, 308 through 317, which lays out exactly what he's describing about how this only applies to landlords that provide dedicated parking spaces. But that's a separate question. The fact of the matter is that this legislation is being proposed before us. We all know that it's subject to change down the road, and I'd like to make sure that there is a distinct definition. The gentleman said there either is or is not 5 parking spaces. Well, I could own a very, very large parking lot and say that those are 5 parking spaces for tractor trailers. Well, that would be different than the same area accommodating maybe 30 vehicles, regular passenger automobiles. So I do think it's relevant, and I think it's unfortunate that the bill doesn't really spell out what that determination is. Now, for example, if you own rental property, you might realize that you can say your property has 5 parking spaces when in fact there's only room for 2 cars in the parking lot, but you might be referring to the fact there's room that there's to park 3 cars on the street. And I don't know that anyone took that into consideration. And I'm concerned that somehow, some way, someone's going to get caught up in this confusion about what a parking space actually is and whether or not a particular rental unit has 5 parking spaces. So that's the reason for my questions. The point here is simply just to find out what the bill says so that the people listening, the many, many landlords that are contacting us who are concerned about the implications of this, some of them who may want to offer this to their tenants in some way, and some that won't want to offer it but will be forced to based on the bill before us. They all deserve to know clearly what this law is going to say. Just moving on. I just want to clarify one last thing about the parking spaces, which is that if a particular landlord has sufficient parking, say the 5 parking spaces is not an issue, but it is community parking, there is no specific parking space, would that change the requirement on the landlord or the tenant in any way through this legislation? Either to prohibit the landlord from being able to accommodate a tenant who wants to have an electrical vehicle charging station, or to require them to do so because they have sufficient room. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Haskell.
I'm sorry, could the good senator repeat the question? I'm not sure I understood the situation contemplated.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. My brain has already moved on to the next question, but let me see if I can dig that back up. I guess what I'm asking is whether or not this determination about the number of parking spaces or whether there are community spaces that are sufficient would impact this legislation. I'll just use an example. Suppose someone owns a 3-family house. There's no question there's plenty of parking. There's 10 parking spaces in the back of it, but the tenants do not have parking included in their rent. So they are community parking spaces, first come, first serve kind of thing. Does that create a situation where the landlord would be prohibited from accommodating a tenant who came to them? Or does it or would the landlord be required to accommodate a tenant even though he has designated these as community spaces rather than by unit? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Haskell.
Sure. So I would say that in this scenario contemplated, in a multifamily dwelling unit where there are 10 spaces, if the landlord chooses to just install 1 electric charger, well, then they're entirely exempt from the rest of this bill. If those 10 spaces are available on a community basis and are not considered a dedicated parking space, well, then they are also not impacted by this bill. Under this legislation, a dedicated parking space is a space located within a lessee's separate interest or a parking spot that is a common area, but subject to an individual lessee's exclusive use right. So if I understand the good senator's hypothetical, an individual who is renting one of those multifamily units, who is parking in a common element space, but that parking space is not mentioned or contemplated or provided as a part of their rental agreement, that landlord wouldn't be impacted by this bill.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate that answer very much. Just moving on, I know that there is lines 337 through 339, which just bear pointing out, which says a landlord shall not be obligated to provide an additional parking space to a tenant in order to accommodate an electric vehicle charging station, which I think is a good call. Lines 353 through 365 have to do with the payment to the landlord. And without reading through the whole thing, I just want to verify through you, Madam President, that it appears from reading this that it is the responsibility of the tenant to make payment to the landlord prior to any modification or improvement to the rental property, so that the actual payment has to occur before the landlord does any work or is required to. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Haskell.
This legislation establishes a framework whereby the tenant and landlord have to agree to a variety of conditions. One is installation, usage, maintenance, and removal of the EV charging station and its infrastructure must be paid for by the tenant. Permission from the landlord to withhold all or part of the security deposit at the end of tenancy for any damages that the landlord suffered if the tenant fails to comply with the requirements on maintenance and removal of the charging station. The bill also requires the tenant to pay for a complete financial analysis and scope of work regarding the EV charging station and associated infrastructure. It requires payment to the landlord for any costs associated with the installation and its infrastructure before any modification or improvement to the rental property. To the good senator's question, there is a timeline stipulated there. And finally, payment as a part of rent for the landlord's incurred costs associated with electric usage of the EV charging station. So this establishes a framework that we hope tenants and landlords can mutually agree to, and it does in fact require that the landlord is compensated prior to installation.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate that answer, and thank you for confirming that the payment to the landlord has to be made prior to any modifications. I do want to touch on some of the other items that was just mentioned by the good senator. I know that there is a subsection 6, which says maintenance of a general liability insurance policy that covers an electric vehicle charging station at a tenant's dedicated parking space. Has to be purchased, and the landlord's name has to be added. Is there a way for a landlord to determine the status of that insurance policy after it's procured, maybe 6 months or a year down the road? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Haskell.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, this is language that was requested by the landlords and realtors themselves, so I believe that this is something they understand will be suitable to their needs, but I don't see as a part of the general liability insurance policy that's contemplated here any specificity in terms of how the landlord shall be informed of that policy.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. Yeah, that's a small concern. I definitely agree that the requirement for a general liability policy is beneficial to both the landlord and the tenant, and something important to include. Although I do wish there was some way for the tenant to be able to maintain that policy in a way that keeps the landlord properly informed. Just moving on to the next section after that, subsection 7 has to do with the requirement for a tenant to post a surety bond in an amount equal to the cost of removing the station, or to permit the landlord to withhold all or a portion of the security deposit. So it says either or, and I guess my question is, who makes that determination? What is sufficient? Through you, Madam President? Is the landlord the one that would make the determination that they would be happy with keeping the security deposit in such a case or requiring a surety bond? Or is the tenant the one that makes that determination? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Haskell.
Thank you, Madam President. Through you, this bill, as I've said before, lays out a foundation for a written agreement between landlord and tenant, so I suppose both sides would have to agree. But the reason for the or and not the and, in fact, in earlier iteration of this draft had and, surely nobody in this circle believes that a landlord should be able to both collect on the cost of removal for the charging station and also keep the charging station, right? You can't have their cake and eat it too. So this forces the landlord and the tenant to agree to what might happen in the event that the charging station is left behind. Either they can be compensated for its removal or they can keep it and treat it as a fixture, but they can't have both.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. Yeah, no, I appreciate the gentleman's remarks, although I don't believe that there is the same concern over forcing the landlord to accommodate the tenant in many other ways in this legislation that is before us. In the next section, it says a requirement for the tenant to agree to designate the electric vehicle charging station as a fixture after they leave at the end of their lease or before. I'm just curious what that language actually means. What does it mean to designate the charging station as a fixture? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Haskell.
Thank you, Madam President. This is, again, language that was drawn up in consultation with the Realtors, the Landlord Association, and the Condo Association. My understanding of fixture is sometimes a refrigerator or a lighting appliance may be left behind, and this will be treated in a similar way.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I guess a final question about the language that's before us. Is there anything in our laws that would prohibit any of this from happening currently? And more specifically, is there anything that would prevent me or any other landlord from working out a situation with my tenant to allow them to install an electric vehicle charging station? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Haskell.
Thanks, Madam President. Through you, no. And this legislation wouldn't in any way restrict that interaction from happening now. It lays the framework for what we believe to be a fair agreement between the landlord and the tenant, such that those who live in multifamily units are not excluded from this transition to electrification. It would be a tragedy if 10 years from now in this chamber, single-family homes all across Connecticut had charging infrastructure installed, and yet everybody who lived in condos, multifamily units, who lived in, anyone who rented the place where they sleep at night like I do, that they were left behind in this transition. So that's what this legislation seeks to do. Of course, the free market may continue to operate and any landlord may install charging infrastructure should they so choose. In fact, if they do so at an acceptable or at a rate of 15% or 10%, depending on the section that we're talking about, they're actually exempted from this legislation altogether.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. There's a lot there to unpack. I would not describe creating a framework as anything other than dictating to our constituents what they must do. Although I will admit that I find this bill quite puzzling in a number of ways because it actually does create several open doors for landlords. First and foremost, I think you're off the hook if you simply do not dedicate any parking spaces to your tenants and you revise all future leases so that they are no longer including a parking space. It seems to me that that would preclude you from ever having to accommodate your tenant via this framework. I bring that up not because I think that's something that landlords should do, but I do believe landlords should know that they still do have that freedom, at least temporarily, until this law passes and this legislature comes back next year or the year after to quietly deprive them of the ability to make that determination for themselves, which is what this is all about, Madam President. This is a bill that opens the door to slowly depriving the actual owners of property of their right to do what they want with it. It's unbelievable that it could be categorized or characterized rather as a framework for a landlord and a tenant. It's not a framework. It is an infringement on the freedoms of our constituents that we are supposed to represent. This whole section is referred to as the right to charge section. Well, there is no right to charge, Madam President. You don't get that right because charging requires that someone else provides the charging facility or the ability to place one there for you. And that's something you don't have a right to. None of us have the right to work or production from another. That's the point of rights. It's to protect us from infringement from our fellow citizens. We have the right to make our own choices. And one of the rights that has been protected in this great country of ours since its beginning is property rights. The right to do what you want with your property. Because at the end of the day, all the properties mentioned in Section 4 of this bill belong to someone else. They do not belong to the Connecticut State Senate. And the Connecticut State Senate shouldn't be telling these people what to do with their property, even if it's just a framework. It's up to them what they do with their property. And I believe that those property rights and the fact that people purchase property for a purpose, which is to better themselves and create and generate income and wealth, is what has driven our country's engine to get us to this point, where we live in the most prosperous time in all the history of mankind. When you, as a government, come in and you tell someone that they no longer have the right to choose how to use their property the way they want, which is infinite, by the way, they can choose a multitude of ways to use their property, and you take that away and you say, no, Mr. Landlord, your property, we're going to tell you how it can be used from now on. And you do it in a limited fashion. It can only be used this way. You are limiting that engine. And you are also depriving every citizen, that landlord, his tenant, who might aspire to own their own property and put an electric vehicle charging station on, you're depriving them all of the incentive to do so. Madam President, I have, the clerk is in possession of an amendment. It is LCO 5426. I ask that it be called and I be allowed to summarize.
Mr. Clerk.
LCL number 5426, Senate Schedule C.
Please proceed, sir.
Thank you, Madam President. This is a very simple amendment. It simply strikes Section 4 of Senate Bill 4 and in effect removes the sections that would place a mandate that landlords shall approve a tenant's written request to install electrical vehicle charging stations on their property. I move adoption, and I'd ask for a roll call vote.
And a roll call vote has been requested, and the question, and we will indeed honor that request. Senator Haskell, the question is on adoption. Will you remark?
Thank you, Madam President. Just very briefly, I would urge my colleagues to reject the amendment, and I would reject the notion that any renter in Connecticut needs incentive in order to become a property owner. The issue is, for 33% of us at least, that many folks can't afford to own property in Connecticut, and surely they too should have an opportunity to charge their electric vehicle. This bill, I think, takes substantial steps to make the electric vehicles more affordable, but a lot of good that will do if the folks who live in multifamily units aren't able to actually charge that vehicle. This legislation doesn't require landlords to pay for the installation, the maintenance, the electrical costs, even the removal of that charging station. Just as I'm free to bring something into my apartment that I rent as a fixture, this bill sets up a process whereby the same protections are available for both the landlord and the tenant. The cost is going to be on the tenant, but the choice is going to fall with the tenant too. And I guess that's the crux of where my good colleague and I disagree. I don't want to leave behind the 1 in 3 Connecticut residents who live in multifamily units. I think many of us aspire to be property owners as well one day. I don't think that this legislation undoes that incentive. I think that a lot of folks just can't afford to do it yet.
Thank you. Senator, will you remark further on the amendment? Good afternoon or evening, Senator Champagne.
Thank you, Madam President. All right.